Good morning, this is Mr. Harold, and I'm here today to talk about Old English and the Anglo Saxon time period. First, let me start off with a quick introduction on what Old English really is.
The History of English in 10 minutes. Chapter 1, Anglo Saxon, or Whatever Happened to the Jutes. The English language begins with the phrase, "Up yours, Caesar," as the Romans leave Britain, and a lot of Germanic tribes start flooding in. Tribes such as the Angles and the Saxons, who together gave us the term Anglo-Saxon, and the Jutes, who didn't. The Romans left some very straight roads behind, but not much of their Latin language. The Anglo-Saxon vocab was much more useful, as it was mainly words for simple everyday things like house, woman, loaf, and werewolf. 4 of our days of the week were named in honour of Anglo-Saxon gods. They didn't bother with Saturday, Sunday and Monday, as they'd all gone off for a long weekend. While they were away, Christian missionaries stole in, bringing with them leaflets about jumble sales and more Latin. Christianity was a hit with the locals and made them much happy to take on funky new words from Latin like martyr, bishop and font. Along came the Vikings, with their action man words like drag, ransack, thrust and die. They may have raped and pillaged, but they were also into give and take, 2 of around 2,000 words they gave English, as well as the phrase, "Watch out for that man with the enormous axe."
So obviously that was just for fun, but that gives you an example of what we're talking about when we talk about the Anglos and the Saxons. Let me go into a little bit more detail. So the Anglo-Saxon time period is really the beginning of Britain. This is before they're even called English. What had happened was the Romans had left the island of England at the end of the Roman Empire, and a bunch of Germanic tribes, obviously they're from what we call Germany today, decided to move in. We had the Angles and we had the Saxons. The Jutes were also there, but they weren't nearly as important. The Angles were the dominant group, and so they named it Angle Land, or over time we came to know that as England. Here's a map, and you can see here we have the north section. This is probably where the Angles would be, the south Angles, the middle Angles, the east Angles. At the bottom, this is where we have the Saxons. And then over on the left, this is where we have the native Britons. In America, we have Native Americans. The Native Britons would have belonged to the Druid tribe, and I'll talk about them a little bit going forward. So let me give you just a little quick history here. In the 400s, in the BCs, the Celts landed in England, or you might call them the Celts. Think about the Boston Celtics. They're namely based off of this team. Also, some people with Irish descent go back to this idea. Eventually, though, the Romans came in. This is around 43 BC, so about 400 years later, they invade England and they take over it for the most part. Eventually, though, the Roman Empire falls around 400 AD, and the Romans go back home, and the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes move in, and they last until 1066 when Norman the Conqueror from France invades and conquers England. And when that happens, the Anglo-Saxon time period is pretty much over. So let me just go through some of these groups briefly. Here are the Celts. They were a member of the Breton tribe, which is where we get the name Britain. And they were sort of a mysterious people. They had priests. They believed in magic and nature. The structure Stonehenge, which you've probably seen, was likely used in some of their ceremonies. Nobody really knows how that was put together. It's quite a bit of mystery. They believed a lot in violence and passion, in magic and adventure. This was not a Christian group. This is very much a cult. The Romans came in and they brought their own influences. Let me just bring these up here. They brought economy, they brought organization, they brought government. It was less violent, it was less mysterious, it was less magical, it was more built on science. And we see evidence of Rome and Britain today. Here's an example of Hadrian's Wall. This went all the way across England, actually. So the Romans did build quite a bit when they were there. Of course, eventually the empire contracted, the home city got taken over, and so they had to go back, and that's why the Romans left. Then the Anglo-Saxons came in. The Anglo-Saxons sort of took a little bit of each. They took that magic and mysterious violence nature of the Druids, and then they also took some of the organization of the Romans. And they came up with a language, a new one, which we now call Old English. Now you might think you know what Old English is. Maybe you've read Shakespeare in the past and you think you know what it sounds like. I'll be willing to bet you haven't, though. Watch this brief clip and see just how many words sound familiar.
Chwet we gardina in jardagom, theud kuninga thrunge frunen disprang, shilde sefra shillandum in. Swas jou jong guma goudge wirchen, From omveld gifte man verder berme, verheen aan ulde eft gewonigen, wilde sides, van de wikume laudige lasten, loft uit shell en meichtige huere, man getheon. Hinka schuld goa to gerst of wheeler, velach råferen an fredan were. He huneth a eithran to bremas farther, swears gesidas, swa he self a bad, then den word of weld, weene schuldiga, lef landfruma lange achter. De art hute stoot gringen stefna, is ik on ut fus ethelinges fair.
It sounded like a completely different language, and frankly, it is. Thankfully, you're not going to be reading Beowulf in Old English, you're going to be reading a translation. I already talked a little bit about this, but here's just another map of the Angles coming into the north, the Saxons coming into the south, and the Jutes in this small sense here. So what was Anglo-Saxon life like? Well, they lived in pretty tight-knit communities. Here's an example of an Anglo-Saxon settlement. You would have your main hall where everybody would meet for daily meals and storytelling, parties, of course. You'd have your little villages, your houses, and then around they would have a fence. It almost looks like a Boy Scout community, but it was a very tight-knit group and it was all protected. This was to keep out not only outside invaders, but monsters and evil creatures, which they did believe in back then. Anglo-Saxon society followed this pattern. You had God at the top. Sometimes that was the Christian God. Sometimes that was just random gods. You had the king. You had thanes or warriors. And then you had slaves. So you really needed to hope that you owned land and were a warrior or a soldier. Otherwise, you were probably going to be a slave. All the power came from the king because the king got all of his power from God. Now, as I said earlier, there was a mixture in Anglo-Saxons between the Druids and between the Romans, and this sort of gave us this combination of beliefs. Anglo-Saxon, originally, they believed that there was no afterlife. The only thing you could do was destroy and kill while you're on the earth and take as much stuff as you can, whereas Christians believe the opposite, that there is an afterlife, a heaven and a hell. Anglo-Saxons believed in pride, glory, honor, revenge, and multiple gods, whereas Christians believe the opposite, that you should be merciful and peaceful, and that there was only one God. When you read Beowulf, you're going to see there's a mixture of people messing with the story. What happened was priests got their hands on the story and decided to input their own values. So sometimes you'll be reading about Beowulf seeking revenge, and then you'll read a whole paragraph about how merciful God is. It's bizarre at some point. Now, the Vikings came in at one point, and they destroyed a lot of things in England. And I bring this up not to teach you about the Vikings, but the Vikings are the reason that we only have one story from the Anglo-Saxon time period. They destroyed all of the other works. This is what a Viking looked like. Notice that he really doesn't have any horns. The Vikings destroyed a lot of English settlements, a lot of English culture, and they're the reason that very little remains of that time period. It all came to end with Norman the Conqueror, 1066. He marched in from France and defeated King Harold, who was the final king of England for the Anglo-Saxon time period. Now, the French came in and they combined their culture with the English culture, and that led to what we now know as the Middle Ages, but we're not going to get into those today. So, what was literature like at the time? And that's what you're going to be reading with the story of Beowulf. We really only have one story, but from what we have gathered, literature were all about epic heroes. An epic hero was somebody who was larger than life, he was fighting in brutal conditions, and it was all about obtaining glory. Think about the Odyssey that you read in 9th grade. It's very much the same thing. You have one strong hero going on an adventure in order to conquer something. These were more than entertainment. This was about how you were supposed to live your life. Here's what one might have looked like. Again, they didn't have writing for quite a while, but when they did start to write things down, this is what it would appear. So an epic hero, what is an epic hero? We're going to be talking about heroes a lot in this class, but an epic hero is somebody who is born in a noble sense. They have character traits that reflect society, so they believe in revenge and violence and war, in this case. They can perform superhuman deeds. I'm not talking about lifting 300 pounds, I'm talking about lifting 3,000. These were almost superheroes. And finally, they would always complete acts that the fate of the world rested on their shoulders. So it's not just that they killed an enemy from another town, they had to be fighting dragons and monsters and cyclops. Also, these things are epic poems. They're not just epic heroes. In an epic poem, we follow the hero who goes on several adventures in several different places. He fights many different types of monsters and supernatural elements, and again, he reflects the culture. So, Beowulf itself, what is Beowulf about? It was probably written in the year 750, and we don't know the author. And like I said, it's the only surviving story. It takes place, even though it's written in England, it takes place in Denmark and in Geatland, or Sweden as we call it today. And it's about a hero named Beowulf. When you read it, there's 3 things I want you to look for. And this is what makes it a poem. Because when you read Beowulf, you're going to think, this isn't a poem, it doesn't rhyme. Well, no, Anglo Saxon stories were a little bit different. They used a lot of alliteration. That was how they made their works into poems. Some of that has been lost in translation, but you'll see a little bit of it still. Number 2 is caesura. They like to end lines at random points for effect. So as you read, take a look at where the line breaks are. That's going to add some value to it. And finally, kennings. They didn't like to refer to the same character over and over again by the same name. And they didn't like to use pronouns. So Beowulf is not called he, but he's given lots of different nicknames. Think about Babe Ruth in The Sandlot and how he's called the Sultan of Swat, the Colossus of Clout, the Great Bambino. He has all these different names. That's an example of a kenning. You give somebody a name based on what they do and who they are. So that's just a brief overview on Anglo-Saxon culture and what you're going to be reading about in Beowulf. For this video, what I want you to do is give a brief summary on some of the things that you learned. You probably want to pause and maybe jot down some notes from the PowerPoint, and then give me some questions. What questions do you have, and what questions might others want to ask? Thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.